Inequalities by Cecilia Boitis. What is inequality? Newman believes that inequality has four key components. They are race and ethnicity, social class, sex and gender, and sexuality. According to dictionary.com, it defines inequality as a condition of being unequal, and social inequality as the difference between the rich and the poor. However, today I will focus on economic inequality. And of the three major sociological perspectives, I believe that conflict perspective is the most logical in explaining inequality. The conflict perspective focuses on how the rich and powerful control the weak and poor by enforcing rules and laws to prevent them from achieving success. Societal change happens only when conflict forces changes. The conflict process has been used to promote many social changes. The civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and most recently the 99% movement. Although each and every group is not successful, it does bring awareness to the movement. Like any change, social change can take years or even decades. The factors of economic inequality include financial, poverty, race and ethnicity, and gender. Financial inequality that I will be going over today will be the global, United States, and the shrinking middle class. Inequality globally. According to globalissues.com, almost half the world, over 3 billion people, live on $2.50 a day. As you can see by the graph, the yearly income for those in Western Europe, United States, Canada, and Japan is well over $39,000. But when you compare these wealthy countries to the bottom 16 countries, the difference is striking. These 16 countries live on less than $14,000 a year. And Newman, although globalissues.com has ranked China the 90th wealthy country in the world, with a median yearly income of $10,011.48, Newman points out that economists at the World Bank have recently revised their estimate of poor Chinese because they are growing so fast from 100 to 300 million residents. In the United States, according to the U.S. Bureau of Statistics, the average income for the top 5% of the U.S. household is $180,000, while the average annual income for the bottom 20% of the household is $21,000, and this gap has been growing steadily over the past few decades. Americans really don't understand. They have an idea of what they think and how fast we are growing, but what they don't understand is that's not what they think. It was up until the 1970s. American income, whether you were rich or poor, grew at the same rate. But from 1970 to 2006, Americans with the lowest income, the 90% of us, our income grew at only 16%, while those with the highest income, the 1%, their income grew by 144%. Newman sums it up in a way that everyone can understand by pointing out that in 1967, the wealthiest 20% of Americans accounted for 43% of the total income earned in 1 year. But in 2008, that jumped up 7% to 50%. At the same time, while the bottom 20%, their income dropped from 4.1% to 3.4%. And what class is getting hit the most hard? Well, the middle class. The middle class is shrinking, and more people are struggling just to make ends meet. These middle-class families are one paycheck away from disaster. The proportion of middle-class families that could weather an emergency, that have 3 months of income, saved someplace in a bank, has decreased 10%. In 2000, 39% of Americans could go 3 months, but in 2007, it's only 29%. This is because their income is shrinking. Between 1980 and 1990, the household income grew 8%. But in between 2000 and 2007, the income decreased by 1%. In 10 years, it decreased by 1%. And in 1 year, in 2008 to 2009, it decreased by another 2.9%. Not only is their income decreasing, but workers are seeing their hours cut, employers are not providing the same benefits like pension and retirement, and they are given less opportunities to work overtime. All these factors result in less weekly earnings for the American family. At one time, if you earned $20 an hour, that was considered the middle class wage. You were considered middle class. However, most Americans today only earn 15.57 an hour. That's been adjusted for inflation. That's a nearly 60% drop of income over the last 30 years. And at the same time, while Americans have seen their income drop, corporates have seen their profits rise. The poverty line, the poverty has two factors that we'll be going over today. The poverty line and the faces of poverty in America. The poverty line. The poverty line is a minimum amount of income a family, the federal government believes a family needs for food for 3 months, and then they multiply that by 3. And according to Newman, the poverty line for a family of 4 is $22,162. And that 14.3 of the population of Americans, or 43.6 million Americans, fall below the poverty line. And that's up 13.2 in 2008. In 2009, 9.4% of whites and 12.5% of Asians were below the poverty line. But the shocking statistics are that 25.8, almost 26% of blacks and 25.3% of Latinos fall below the poverty line. Blacks and Latinos make up over 51% of all Americans underneath the poverty line. And the faces of poverty are changing. Although racial and ethnic minorities are still the largest group in poverty, many in the United States would be surprised to know that there is a new breed of those impoverished, the families and children. 15 million American children under the age of 18, 20.7%, live in households under the poverty line. Children make up about 24.5% of total population in poverty, yet in population, yet 35%, a little over 35% of them live in poverty. African Americans are at 34% and Latinos at 30%. This is compared to the 15% for whites and 14% for Asians. And one of the reasons why more families are living in poverty is because more families are being headed by a woman, and women are earning less than men, and they're having a hard time juggling childcare and jobs. But other things have changed too. Not only are you having children, but you have another whole class of what we call the working poor. And the U.S. Bureau of Census finds that 13 million people earn just 25% above the official poverty line. They're near poor, working poor. These families, like we mentioned before, are one paycheck away from disaster. According to the U.S. Bureau of Census, in 2010, the Asians were doing pretty well. They were making about $65,000, a little over $65,000, compared to the $54,000 for whites. And even though Asians were doing pretty good, a little over 52% of them were getting their bachelor's degree. That may be a reason why they're making a little more money. This was compared to a little under 30% for whites, a little over 19% for African Americans, a little over 13% for Latinos. In the last 20 years, the proportion of college graduates who are African American and Latino has doubled, from 8.9% to 17.7%. Even though more Latinos and African Americans are getting degrees and doing better, they still are the poorest and most disadvantaged of all groups in the United States, and their annual income is well below the national median. This is because they have very high unemployment rates compared to whites. In 2011, the black unemployment rate was 15% and the Latinos were 11%. This is, when you compare this to the 8% for whites and 7% for Asians, you can understand why they are living in poverty. Together, the African Americans and Latinos make up to 35.7%, almost 36% 6% of all the unemployed people in the United States. Another factor for inequality is your gender. Women have been fighting for equality since they began working in the factories during World War I. And in 2010, for the first time in history, there were more women in the workplace than men. This was because men were losing their jobs and women were stepping up, going out, and getting jobs to help keep the family income going and help keep the family afloat. But even though there was a lot of women out there, their income was still less than men. For men in 2010, their annual income was $46,367, and women was $35,745, a difference of a little over $10,000. So even though they have come a long way, women were still making quite a lot less than men. When women reach retirement, they will have earned between $70,000 and $2 million less in their working income life than men. And if you're a woman of color, this gap just gets even worse. African American women earn 67% for every man's dollar, and Latinas women earn 57%. If you're an Asian American woman, you're doing a little bit better. You're earning about 88%. Typical female jobs like preschool worker, teacher's assistant, secretary, child worker, they all make about $490 a week, while the ideal male job like airplane pilot, firefighter, plumber, steelworker, their average income is about $948 a week. What can be done about inequality? Well, in the conclusion of Chapter 6, Newman asks, and I thought the same thing, why aren't we distressed about the misery and hardship of others? Why aren't there massive demonstrations over the growing gap between the rich and the very poor? Do we see poverty, unemployment, and homelessness simply as an unfortunate but inevitable side effect of the economic system that works the way it's supposed to, by rewarding those who are successful? And Newman came up with the answer that he believes that it's because people do not see inequality as being unfair. And I thought about that, and I looked back at history, and I could see that that might be a true statement. In the 60s, African Americans, they fought for justice. In the 70s, it was the women's movement. In the 80s, the gay rights. And most recently, the 99%. And if the majority of society thought these groups of people were treated unfairly, social change would have not taken so long. It wouldn't have been such a hard fight. Although each has seen advancements for their groups, they are still fighting for equality. And I believe that change begins within. As a class and as part of society, I challenge each one of you to think about inequality and how you can make a difference.